Starter Pokemon. Such simple yet important members of your team. They are always the cornerstones to help you beat the game and become a Pokemon master. As they may look different over the years, there is still one thing that remains the same about all of them, and that is their typing. Ever since the beginning, the starters have always been fire, water, and grass. As they evolve and change, they add an additional type. But at the core of every single starter Pokemon, it's always fire, water, and grass. This creates what is known as a type triangle. For example, water is super effective on fire, fire is super effective on grass, and grass is super effective on water. This also works in reverse too, as water resists fire, fire resists grass, and grass resists water. But did you know there are a lot more type triangles out there? Well, today we are going to go through them all, and I'll explain them just a little bit more, because some of these triangles are just too difficult to understand. These type matchups are what gives certain Pokemon that competitive edge over the others. Type triangles like these are an easy way to break up the massive type chart into bits and pieces that are able to stick into your memory. This triangle is super easy to understand, and probably the simplest one to comprehend outside of the fire, water, and grass one. And let me tell you why. So fighting is super effective on rock, while rock is super effective on flying, and flying is super effective on fighting. This is super easy to understand because martial artists usually practice slicing through rocks. If someone throws a rock at a bird, you're probably gonna kill them. Then finally, if you're a fighter, you can't fight an opponent if they're flying in the air. If Game Freak ever wanted to switch up their formula for their starters and head in a different direction, but still keep the same sort of type triangle, fighting, rock, and flying is the way to go. This one is also simple and easy to comprehend because poison is super effective against grass, because poison infects plants and grass. Also, poison ivy is kind of a thing. Grass is super effective on ground because many grasses and plants grow in the ground. Ground is super effective on poison because poison can't travel through the ground. It must be attached to something or infect something. Overall, this poison, grass, and ground triangle just makes sense. Why can't all of the type triangles be this easy to understand? This triangle is also super simple and easy to understand. Steel is super effective against rock because rocks sharpen steel. Rock is super effective on fire because rocks are often seen putting out fires. And fire is super effective on steel because fire has the ability to melt steel. Overall, this type triangle is super easy to comprehend. It is also the last of the perfect triangles. What I mean by perfect triangle is that type A, in this case steel, is super effective on type B, which here is rock. But on the defensive side, steel resists rock. But rock is super effective against the third type, which here is fire. But on the defensive side, rock resists fire. And finally, fire is super effective on steel, but on the defensive side, fire resists steel. This works for all of the previous triangles as well, not just this one. So you could mix and match any of those previous typings I mentioned. These past couple type triangles were simple and easy to understand, but the next ones, they're not going to be so easy. This one is a little different as there is an immunity involved here, but we'll get to that in a bit later. But for now, dark is super effective on psychic because smart people, well, they can't see in the dark. This is also where that immunity comes into play, as the dark type is immune to psychic. But on the other hand, psychic is super effective on fighting because being smart is better than being strong. And fighting is super effective on dark because fighters work best at night. That's why ninjas exist. Besides the immunity on this triangle, this is nearly perfect as psychic does resist fighting. The type triangles from here on out, they don't include any resistances anymore. While this triangle doesn't include an immunity, like I said before, there are no resistances here either. So grass is super effective against rock because much like grass and ground, grass and rock act in a similar way. As grass and plants grow in the ground, rock is super effective against ice because rocks break ice. And finally, ice is super effective on grass because ice freezes plants in the winter. This is probably, for me, one of the easiest type triangles to memorize because it just makes much more sense than any of the others. While there are no resistances here either, there is an immunity, which we will get to in a bit. But for now, electric type moves are super effective against water because water conducts electricity. Water is super effective on ground because when water meets ground, it creates sand. But ground, on the other hand, that's the one with the immunity, as it is immune to all electric type attacks because ground doesn't conduct electricity. This one is pretty straightforward to me, but it does get confusing sometimes. This triangle is really simple and easy, and let me tell you why. Bug is super effective against grass because, well, bugs live in grass. Much like grass and ground, grass and rock have a similar relationship where grass grows on rocks, but it's mostly in the form of moss. Lastly, rock is super effective on bug because rocks can easily squash some bugs. This type triangle is easier to memorize for me than any of the others, and let me tell you why. The 3 typings in this triangle just apply so well to the real world, as fire is super effective on ice because fire obviously melts ice. Ice is super effective on ground because ground can get frozen over. And finally, ground is super effective on fire because of volcanic earth and volcanoes. This triangle is simple. Birds eat grass, therefore flying is super effective on grass. As I mentioned before in this video, grass is super effective against rock because grass grows on rocks. And finally, just like the first triangle, if someone throws a rock at a bird, you're probably gonna kill them. Therefore, rock is super effective against flying. This triangle is once again pretty straightforward. To me, this one is also easy to memorize because of the real world. Rock is super effective on fire because rocks are often seen putting out fires. Fire is super effective on grass because fire can easily burn grass. And, well, you already know about grass and rock's relationship. The real world implication of these elements make this type triangle really easy to memorize. For me, this is the last of the type triangles that are easy to memorize, as ice is super effective on flying because, well, birds can freeze. Flying is super effective on fighting because flying in the air just gives you an advantage over being on the ground and fighting. Fighting, meanwhile, is super effective on ice because fighters can punch through ice, kinda like they could do with rock as well. This one is super hard to understand, as there are hardly any real-world scenarios to explain this. Like psychic being super effective on poison, like how do you rationalize that? Maybe everyone watching this could connect the dots, but I just can't. But poison is super effective on bug, because bug spray is a thing, and spraying bug spray, well, it kills them. Finally, bug is super effective on psychic because smart people are afraid of bugs, I guess. It's really weird because part of this type triangle makes sense, while some others, they just don't. This triangle is much harder to understand than any of the others. Fairy is super effective against fighting because I guess fairies have powers that are just better than straight up fighting. Fighting is super effective on steel because much like fighting in rock, martial artists are often seen practicing on steel beams. I don't really have an explanation for steel being super effective on fairy because it's just like, I don't know, they had to nerf fairy in some way. So why not just have steel provide that? This is probably the hardest type triangle to understand in all of Pokemon. First, ground is super effective against steel because earthquakes could happen and it could cause the collapse of a steel house. Steel is super effective against ice because, well, I'm not too sure about that. And finally, ice is super effective on ground because, well, ice freezes up the ground. So those are all of the type triangles in Pokemon. But I bet you're wondering, what about dragon, ghost, and normal? Don't they have type triangles? Well, they do. Actually, Dragon and Ghost do, as it's literally just themselves, as Ghost is super effective against Ghost, and Ghost is super effective against Ghost, and Ghost is super effective against Ghost. It's the same thing for Dragon too. It's kind of weird in my opinion. And finally, the normal type isn't super effective on any of the types, and fighting is the only type that's super effective on normal, and that's because fighters are stronger than your average people. So to conclude, that's almost every Pokemon type triangle. Just like fire, water, and grass, type triangles like these really bring balance to the game of Pokemon, and will for years to come.